Hello, everyone, and welcome to Meet the Researchers with the Southwest Autism Research and Resource Center, or SARC. Today, we are very lucky to be joined by Dr. Sydney Pettygrove, an Associate Professor of Epidemiology at the University of Arizona, and the Epidemiologist for the Arizona Developmental Disabilities Surveillance Program. Thank you so much for joining me today, Dr. Pettygrove.
Thank you for inviting me.
So your team is a part of the Centers for Disease Control, Autism, and Developmental Disabilities Network, which reports the prevalence rates for autism spectrum disorder, or ASD, in children every 2 years. And in March of this year, the prevalence rate was updated from 1 in 59 to 1 in 54. Can you explain the methods your team uses to determine the prevalence rate?
Sure. So when we first started the program, back in the year 2000, there was a lot of concern about finding all of the cases, even though we thought it was likely that some would not be having a diagnosis or recognized in general. So we wanted to set up a set of methods where we would be able to identify children even if they hadn't gotten a diagnosis yet. We go into school districts and clinical sources, and we review records, and we look for comprehensive developmental evaluations. And when we look through these evaluations, we're looking at the notes, and we're looking for notations of the types of behaviors that you would expect to see in a child who's on the autism spectrum. And then we've got trained clinical experts that would look at the information on each child and make a determination whether that child meets the criteria to be called a case of autism spectrum disorder. That's the number of cases we find. The other piece of information that we need to have in order to say it's 1 in 56 or 1 in 64 or 16 cases per 1,000, which is how we usually talk about it. The other piece of information that we need to know how many children we have living in our study area. So we find a number of cases, and then we have to say, okay, well, that's 200 cases out of how many children? And so that second part is something that I think people don't tend to think about. So when people are considering whether to fill out that census form, I would implore them to please, yes, do fill out the census form. But that's how we figure out those numbers. It's actually a lot of work. The reason why we...
That's what I was about to say. Sounds like a lot of work.
It really is. It really is. The reason why we only publish every other year is because it actually takes us 2 years between, collecting all the information and cleaning it up and doing quality control checking and then putting it through the process of having our clinical experts decide whether children meet the case definition or not. It's a 2-year process.
So one explanation for some of the increase in prevalence that we've seen over the years is that the awareness of autism has increased over time.
Right.
How do you think increased awareness contributes to rising rates of autism?
So the question then is, how does a child, because we don't get to look at the children, so the question then, what we really need to think about how awareness plays into this is we need to think about all the steps that are involved in how a child gets a record that we are able to then review and say, yes, this child is meets the definition of a case of autism spectrum disorder. And so we look at it, and the first thing that has to happen for that child is that some adult in their life needs to recognize that they need an evaluation, right? So it could be a parent, a caregiver, a physician, a teacher. But somebody has to say, you know, I think that this child needs to have an evaluation. So that's one step. The next step is that evaluation needs to take place. So, you know, we know that different families have different levels of access to health care in this country, and certainly in the state of Arizona. And so not every family is equally able to ensure that an evaluation takes place once somebody has recommended that that happen. So if you think about it, if no adult recognizes the need for an evaluation, then that child is invisible to our system because we're only going to see them once they have a record. So, or if the evaluation does not take place, again, that child is invisible to the way we work. So once somebody has identified the child, gotten them the evaluation, then we need to know, in order to count the child, we need to have the evaluator be sufficiently aware of autism to be able to recognize behaviors that are consistent with autism. And we need to make sure then that evaluator is documenting those, because that's what we're going to be relying on. So that's the final step is those behaviors documented in the record. Then we can come along, however much later, and we can look at the notes and we can say, yes, based on what we see documented in this record, this child fully meets the criteria to be considered a case of autism. So if at any part of this, someone does not recognize that the child needs an evaluation, or if the evaluator is less savvy about autism spectrum disorders, but if any of those things fail to happen, that child would be invisible to us. And so to the extent that we've got an increased level of awareness in the society in general over time, you can see that parents and caregivers and physicians and other adults are much more likely to recognize, yes, we need to get an evaluation. The evaluators, as they've gotten more training in autism, they're more likely to say, I recognize this behavior as being something that would be consistent with autism, and I'm going to make sure that I write that in the record. So as these things have changed over time, you can see that fewer children would remain invisible to our system of counting.
Thank you so much for sharing your insight into the 1 in 54 statistic that our families hear so frequently, Dr. Pettygrove. And for our viewers at home, if you're interested in learning more about autism research at SARC, click on this link to fill out an online interest form and a member of our research team will contact you. You can also visit SARC's website, autismcenter.org. Thank you, Dr. Pettygrove, for joining me today, and thanks to everyone at home for watching. We'll see you next time on SARC's Meet the Researchers.